Hey everyone, welcome to another Department of Dreams session. This afternoon we've got with us Sarah Drummond and Rebecca Squirrell from Snook, and we're going to be having a talk and a bit of a workshop around why we need a long-term future thinking, why we need long-term future thinking now. Really excited to get involved in this one, and I know we're running a little bit over time, so apologies for that, but I'm sure it will be a really exciting experience for everyone. And so I'm going to hand straight over to Rebecca and Sarah to kick us off with the workshop.
Right, thanks Daniel. We had some technical Wi-Fi connection issues, as most of you are probably used to already, of shouting down the screen, can you hear me, can you hear me? So hopefully you can. Can I just get a little thumbs up from people that you're all, or just a, yeah, okay, good, there's a few, thank you. We've basically decided if my Wi-Fi cuts out, Rebecca's just going to skip to the kind of more future scenario part of our workshop, which is a bit more interactive, but hopefully we'll stick with you. So yeah, just a really warm welcome. We're going to share some slides on the screen. If Rebecca, you can get them up, is that possible?
Yeah, just going to try and do that now.
Just while we get started, yeah, so thanks. So it's a real pleasure to have you all here today, and thank you so much for choosing to come and spend some time with us. We're Snook. If you haven't heard of us before and you've come based on the title of this workshop, we're a design studio. We're built to make the world more human. We're trying to design a world that helps people and planet thrive. We're not going to really talk much about design today. We're going to talk about the future, if you want to jump to the next slide. And we want to talk a bit about this today, which is a blog post we wrote about asking for the fact that we need longer term thinking at the moment, kind of moving from this emergency panic mode that we've been in into thinking about what a kind of new world looks like, but that being really difficult because we're living in a world of uncertainty. If you want to jump to the next slide. And what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of introduce that concept, and we're then going to tell a bit of a story about systems change and cholera, which I think a couple of you on the call might have actually heard before. And you might think that's slightly strange, but we're going to share that in a sense of thinking about what it means to be someone trying to change things and change systems from an individual perspective. And then Rebecca's going to lead us through a scenario exercise we've been working on at Snook, and just give you a bit of chance and a bit of time, hopefully, to reflect and think about what the future might mean and what we might need to prepare ourselves for that. So hopefully you just get a bit of time to think and pause today and take a deep breath. And then we're going to close and hope, in the hope that you've enjoyed the session, or at least got something from this. So yeah, if we move on. So I guess this has been called like a kind of great pause to dream and to rethink, and to look at what the next normal looks like. And I sort of just wanted to pause on that for 1 second, and the fact that this hasn't really been a great pause to dream. This has been a situation that's caused a massive amount of pain for a lot of people, loss, grief, a lot of anxiety, a lot of pressure. And actually, if we can jump to the next slide, I guess a sense of that's been really difficult to sort of deal with. And we start to think about, well, if we're considering what the future means, but we're experiencing all of this uncertainty, it's really difficult to plan and to dream for that at the same time. And sorry, Rebecca, do you want to jump to the next slide? And I think this really impacts our ability, this uncertainty impacts our ability to both dream and to plan for that at the same time. And many of you might have occupations or jobs or projects or things that you do in your daily life where you're trying to think about how things might want to be different in the future based on this pausing period, but it being very difficult to also plan for that because it's so uncertain. So we want to just unpack that a little bit today and discuss it. Next slide. And so some of the conversations that have been going on and part of this festival is about dreaming about new futures and what that looks like and what that might mean. But a lot of the dreams that we have and are sharing are about deep systemic change. And we want to just reflect on that today about what it means to be someone who is trying to encounter and take on that change as an individual and as collectives and networks in trying to change those systems. So we would just want to respect that a lot of the dreams that we have are really deep systems work and really challenging. Next slide. So we're going to talk just really briefly about a program we ran called Systems Changers, just to kind of tee off the story we're about to tell. But one of the framings that we used for that was about these sort of three lenses that were focusing on yourself as an individual. So what does it mean to be an individual trying to change systems? What does that mean for an organisation trying to change and affect systems? And what does it mean in the wider system when you're trying to affect change as well? So we want to kind of pick up on these lenses. We're going to start with the individual today and focus mostly on that, because we think it's quite important for the conversations we've had to look at our own resilience in these times of uncertainty and how we plan for the future. So just a bit about the programme that we ran. It was a programme called Systems Changers, and sorry, one second, there we go. A programme called Systems Changers. And I think one of the reasons that this came together, it was a fund by Lankelly Chase, a programme run by the Point People, and we kind of supported delivering it. And I really like this quote, sort of summed up for some of the reasons about why we ran this programme that I'll tell you about in a second. That when we try to change things, it becomes less apparent where problem centres lie and less apparent where and how we should intervene, even if we do happen to know what aims we seek. And by now we're all beginning to realise that one of the most intractable problems is that of defining problems and of locating problems. And I guess a big thing about systems change is locating those problems and knowing, you know, kind of what the boundary is of the things that we're trying to dream about changing. And the sort of second quote that really resonated with me about this work was from Dan Hill's work around taking a system-orientated view of problems and challenges, the idea that healthcare is responsibility of a Department of Health. But health is directly affected by urban planning, transportation, and other infrastructure, patterns of employment, food, education, etc., etc. And so on, most of which will sit outside of the neatly defined boundaries of one department. And that's what makes system change really hard for us as individuals, because it is so interconnected and interwoven to so many interdependencies of the things we're trying to change, whether we're trying to create more healthy lives or change the way that the pollution and our carbon count in the environment, whether we're trying to change the way that government works. It's so interdependent on so many nodes and things that systems change can feel quite hard. So that was one of the reasons that we set up Systems Changers, but with a kind of direct question to look at whether people who work directly at the front line had the ability and power to look at systems, to understand them and to challenge them and to actually make system change happen. So the question was, what and how can people at the front line do? And this was a programme that, as I said, was funded by Lankelly Chase and brought together cohorts of about 12 people in each programme, laterally run with the Children's Society in the sort of third season of it. And it was about sort of between a 6 to 12 month programme where we had all of these. I just want to kind of promo these guys because they're absolutely amazing. Wonderful people from different organisations who work in youth justice, in supporting people who are homeless, in the criminal justice system, in kind of working with the travellers community, all people that are seeking to support individuals in our society who I guess Lankelly would describe as facing multiple disadvantage. And so that system that's designed around them not being able to support the kind of outcomes that their services are trying to deliver to them because of lots of system pressures. And so we asked that question of can and how can the insights of frontline workers influence systems change? And some of the things that we just did on that programme was to try and get people to actually draw and sketch what they thought that system looked like, how it impacted the people that they were trying to support. The sort of training that we sort of provided and as provocations was things about design thinking, which is a lot of like what Snook does, looking at how you design and improve services, how you test and prototype ideas to transform them. But the other sort of two nodes were around systems thinking, so looking at systems mapping, as you just saw, system dynamics and different perspectives on what influences systems, but also change making as well. So how do you actually tell your story and take on forms of campaigning to make change happen? And sort of the theory was to bring these three elements together, that we might be able to support people to think about how they make change happen in lots of different ways. And a big part really of the programme was about being able to see the system, experiment with change, but finding the areas where there was flex, where you could actually find a sort of lever to pull that might change something else, but being able to recognise what the right levers were to pull. And a big part really of this program was that it wasn't really supposed to be, which traditionally you see these sort of training programs as personal development. It wasn't really supposed to be solutionism, as in, you know, we'll solve this system and we'll change it to impact the people that we support, but really about holding a space for insights around having different vantage points of what that system looks like, particularly from a frontline perspective. And one of the things that was quite difficult to teach and train and think about was all of those things in less than 6 months. It was very, very difficult. But the people we got to work with were absolutely wonderful, and many of them have gone on to do some incredible new programs of work, bringing together different elements of the system to look at how people can be better supported, how systems can actually be changed. But the key kind of difficult thing was about holding sort of plural ideas for change and not trying to shrink that systemic view. And what we found through this program is that, and we probably know this, and I'm hoping you're sort of nodding on the call in a sense, is that systems change, and the things that we dream about changing can feel like a really intangible, unachievable, overwhelming. These were a lot of the words that we heard from our frontline, and sometimes really unrewarding concept. And one of the things that I had a real pleasure in delivering on this program was a story, and it was a story about systems change and about individuals within it, and about the struggle of that systems change, and about poo, which I'm going to talk to you about. And I hope you got a bit of a smile on your face, because I think it's a really interesting story, and it's based on a fantastic book called The Ghost Map by PhD, I think it's Stuart Hall or Stuart King, I've forgotten his name, which is really bad, wrote this book about the finding of cholera and the sort of transformation of helping people in the system understand what cholera is and how it's transmitted. And it's such a fascinating story that I'm going to share it with you today. And I'm just going to try and talk for a sort of brief 15 minutes about that story. And I just want you to kind of listen to it and hopefully enjoy it. I think it's quite an interesting story. And just think about what it means to try and drive system change from an individual perspective. And we're going to do a bit of a kind of group reflection at the end on that. So I'm going to talk to you about this: a pump, a researcher, and a deadly disease. And I'm just going to start actually with a bit of a reading from the book, The Ghost Map, just to set us up. So this is a story with 4 protagonists: a deadly bacterium, a vast city, and 2 gifted but very different men. One dark week, 150 years ago, in the midst of great terror and human suffering, their lives collided on London's Broad Street on the western edge of Soho. This book is an attempt to tell the story of that collision in a way that does justice to the multiple scales of existence that helped bring it about, from the invisible kingdom of microscopic bacteria to the tragedy and courage and camaraderie of individual lives, to the cultural realm of ideas and ideologies, all the way up to the sprawling metropolis of London itself. It is a story of a map that lies at the intersection of all of those different vectors, a map created to help make sense of an experience that defied human understanding. It is also a case study in how change happens in human society, the turbulent way in which wrong or ineffectual ideas are overthrown by better ones. More than anything else, though, it is an argument for seeing, it's an argument, that's gone wrong, apologies. Everyone loves technology and Kindles. It's an argument for seeing that terrible week as one of the defining moments in the invention of modern life. So I want you to sort of think about a modern London, how that feels. Well, it feels a bit different right now, but how that feels. And then I want you to try and take your mind back about 220 years, so back to sort of early 1800s. And just to kind of set the scene for you, it's about 2.5 million people living in a 30-mile circumference. So the city was actually quite dense in a sense. There was no visual like sewage system. There was a monopoly of different water boards trying to sort of get things running. There wasn't really any public health departments collecting any statistics. And this really wasn't that, this is only about 200 years ago. So it's a very, very different London that we might recognize. But yeah, not a very long time ago. And as I said, there was no visual sewage system that anyone could see. But there was a kind of informal service of night soil men, tanners, lots of other kinds of roles of people literally clearing out about 200,000 cesspools of human waste that were kept in basements and underneath homes. And it was this amazing kind of self-built infrastructure and system to deal with that quite literal human problem, because we had no kind of master plan for a system. And I just want you to kind of think a little bit about the smell and what that feels like, and just recognise that informal service of waste removal was one of the most important things that had to be done, really. And people were really ill from the smell. You can see from a lot of kind of like visual material from back in the day, that there were sort of cartoons about the smell and literally kind of how that made people feel very ill and very sick. And I want to go back to one specific street in London in 1854, called Broad Street. And in 1854, in 3 days, over 700 people died within one block in that area. And it was really unknown about what the cause of that was, and we'll come to talk about that in a second. But just to kind of give you a depiction of the street, it was busy. There was manufacturers, opticians, pubs, churches, factories in the area. There was lots of different class systems that interacted within the buildings, living on different and staying on different levels. Marx even stayed there at one point in time. And so it was a really kind of hustle bustle of an area. And overall, over the period of 1853 to 1854, more than 10,000 Londoners were killed by cholera, and 700 in this block. And the story really centres, you can centre the story right back down to Thomas and Sarah Lewis, whose child passed away at a really young age from cholera. And what happened is that Sarah Lewis took her baby got diarrhea, and she took the nappies, and as what you did in the day, she rinsed the nappy out with water. We obviously didn't have Huggies and designer nappies. We had towels, and she washed them out, and that water was then thrown into a cesspool which went down into the garden in the basement. And that's the sort of centre point actually of where the kind of epicenter of where the disease started in terms of its spread. And if you don't know what cholera is, just to kind of take you through what that is, cholera is an infection of the small intestine by some strains of the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, and symptoms range from kind of none to mild to severe. And the classic symptom is large amounts of watery diarrhea that lasts a few days. And sometimes like vomiting and muscle cramps can also occur. And diarrhea can be so severe that it leads to hours of severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. So it kind of results in sunken eyes and cold skin, and wrinkling of the hands and feet. And people don't really understand that dehydration sort of leads to death and tends to take place sort of 2 to 5 days after infection. And the real challenge with all of this is that people believed that this disease was airborne. But it was actually transmitted through water. And this Freudian term of over-determination took hold of society, actually. And the people that believed that cholera was airborne we call them miasmatists. So everyone, and lots of people who I'll come to talk about in government, Public Health England, as we started to create new institutions, all believed that the disease was airborne. And things like smell really contribute to that belief system, because people felt very sick from the stench. And this was really perpetuated by the media, and you can sort of blame a bit of them in perpetuating that myth, with a lot of the diagrams that they used, and the language that they used. There's one article in the 1850s from the Morning Chronicle, which is kind of quite a famous newspaper at the time, and how they read, said, on entering the precincts of the island, the air literally had the smell of a graveyard, and that was to do with the kind of amount of cesspools. So this kind of very deep sensory experience led people to believe that the disease was airborne. So there's a few protagonists, as the start of the book mentioned. And one of them is someone called Benjamin Hall, who is the president of the Board of Health in the UK at the time. And he established and continued the development of the Nuisances and Removals Contagious Diseases Act. And the challenging thing was that Benjamin was also a miasmatist himself. And so I think it's really important to reflect on the fact that you have miasmatists at this time who are in charge of government and setting up the strategy and the policies in which to deal with this. So another character in the story who you might have heard of is Sir Edwin Chadwick, who was a social reformer really noted for his work to reform poor laws, and I think genuinely really cared around improving things like sanitary conditions and public health, and he did quite a lot of work in that space in the 1800s. But Edwin Chadwick was also a miasmatist, like many people were. But what's really interesting about Edwin is that he was given the task to rethink sewage in London and sort of pull together this as a master plan and how it would be realised. So again, I think it's just important to recognise that government, without the actual data, could still think in this way. And what's really difficult about changing a system like that, and the challenge that Edwin had, is that creating a kind of master plan for a sewage system is really difficult when the system of ownership in terms of that infrastructure is really fragmented. And that is, I'm sure you'll recognise in your own work, nothing new. If you take a look at the Strand in the 1800s in London, they had 9 different pavement boards who each looked after different elements of the pavement. So everyone had this fractious relationship around who owned the infrastructure and whose job it was to improve it. They had different boards for the lighting, different boards for the roads. So to try and change a system required a lot of work on other interdependent boards and bodies and power systems. And I think I really like this quote from the book, from Ghost Map, is that, this is really a human problem. To take on a project as epic as building an integrated metropolitan sewer system would require more than just, engineering prowess alone. It would need a revolution in the power dynamics of city life. And so Edwin Chadwick had a real job on his hands. But I hope that just gives you a bit of a sense of the kind of the backdrop for the rest of the story in terms of what London felt like, what the kind of movements were from government, but the kind of overriding over-determinism of the miasmatists believing that cholera was airborne. So I'm going to enter our first hero, historical dude called Dr. John Snow. Just to give you a quick background from him, he's originally from the north, I think northeast, around Sunderland. He was one of the first physicians to study and calculate dosages for the use of ether and chloroform as surgical anaesthetics. He died quite young. That's because he spent a lot of time trying the chloroform himself and testing things in his home. So he built a lot of his own equipment and took stuff from different laboratories to do this work. And he experienced the first sweep of cholera deaths in Sunderland earlier on in the 1850s and felt really compelled actually to do something about this. And he spent a lot of time at home analysing stool samples. He knew it was waterborne. He'd found sort of different elements of bacteria in the water, but couldn't really disprove the miasmatists. And a lot of people he wanted to interview about their experience had passed away, so it was really difficult to actually track where people were drinking water from. So a kind of other really cool historical dude that leads the story is a guy called William Farr. And I just want to make an apology. I'm really sorry these are all men. I genuinely like to tell stories with much more diversity of people, but it is the historical story in the sense of what we know. But just wanted to note that. But William Farr was one of the first compilers of scientific abstracts. He was a statistician. And he collected data on mortality rates and occupations for the official medical statistics in England and Wales. And what was really great that he did is he got them published in the Morning Chronicle. And John Snow started to use that data to try and understand where there were correlations in deaths and water. But I think what's really important to state at this stage is that John had tried and so many times to get people to believe through scientific publications, letters to editors, writing to the government about this being waterborne and trying to help. And he was ridiculed a lot actually in the press. So a lot of people didn't really believe him or believe that cholera could be waterborne. So what John did is he used a tool around visual mapping to try and produce that evidence and create new vantage points. And he examined water samples from various wells under a microscope to try and find where the bacterium was. And then what he tried to do was to show where these water pumps were on a map and then where the deaths were. And what he started to find in his data is that there were epicenters of lots of deaths around different water pumps. So he started to correlate all of this data. At the same time, there was other investigations going on behind the scenes because of Chadwick's work. looking at who the different owners were of different parts of the underground. There was lots of different water companies, and there was two in particular, Southwark and Vauxhall and Lambeth, which drew the water directly from the Thames, that were connected to this pump as well. And so he was able to start correlating all these sets of data, but he still couldn't prove his point, and he was still told that he wasn't right. So I want to kind of introduce the sort of awkward dude, but who came to be our kind of third hero protagonist. And it's a local reverend called Henry Whitehead, who was from the area, and he really knew the residents in the streets. And I think it's important to say outright about Henry Whitehead is that he was also a miasmatist. And he set out to collect evidence so that he could disprove Snow's theory, because he didn't want to believe it. He wanted to believe that it was airborne. But what Henry Whitehead was able to do that John Snow wasn't, was to go in and talk to the community, because he was trusted. And I think it's kind of an incredible hero story for him, that even though he was a miasmatist and he believed it was airborne, that he took the risk to go in and talk to people who had been experienced cholera symptoms and deaths in their family. And what he found was quite interesting. I guess the first story really was that he was really confused about a woman who was an outlier of that data set. So she died on the kind of periphery of London from cholera, where nobody else had, yet no one else had died around her. And so he spoke to her two sons, and they said that they would use the Broad Street pump because they worked in the area, because she preferred the taste of that water. It tasted a bit cleaner than the water she got. And they would take it home for her and give her this. And she obviously, unfortunately, died, and he thought, this is really interesting, and starts to align with some of Snow's theories. Some of the other stories that he found was that nobody from the local factory that worked in the area passed away. And when he went and actually interviewed the owner of the factory, he found that they'd actually installed their own tap, which was connected to different water boards. So they'd been drinking effectively clean water that hadn't been infected under the ground. And so by having this underground research about the sort of Lambeth and Vauxhall water boards, Snow was able to establish that what had happened is water had seeped in through very, very thin mud walls from the cesspools into one of the water kind of, it's not a pipe, a sort of lineway, and actually got into the sort of well that fed the pump. And so started to sort of, I guess, start to prove this theory. And what had happened is that when the mother had poured the dirty water from the nappy, it had gone in to infect this pump. And I think I love this story because it's such a fantastic way of thinking about how you start to bring about systems change, because you have to collect lots of data to show what does and doesn't work, what is true, what is false, and try and create a case and a narrative. And I kind of think it's a form of sort of qualitative ethnography and quantitative data science coming together. But this wouldn't have worked if there wasn't a partnership between two very kind of diametrically opposing people, Whitehead and Dr. John Snow. And they still wouldn't listen to John Snow, but because of the Reverend's Henry Whitehead's influence and kind of power within that local system, he was able to get the local parish church to remove the lever from the pump. And if you can imagine what happened, the deaths toll slumped, and you would think all was well, but actually what was incredibly sad is that the government still wouldn't believe them, and we'll just come on to that in 1 second. But I just want to read out this entire quote because I feel to me like this sort of epitomizes lots of feelings I have around systems change and yourself as an individual and what your talents are, but what actually is really important about it. And it said, Snow's observational talents extended beyond the human body. The tide eventually turned not because of his skills as a doctor or scientist. It wasn't lab research that would ultimately persuade the authorities. It wasn't direct observation of V. cholerae itself. It was Snow's faithful, probing observation of urban life and its everyday patterns. The malt liquor drinkers at the Lion Brewery, the late night trips for cold water on hot summer nights, the tangled web of private water supplies in South London. Snow's breakthrough in anaesthesia had revolved around his polymath skills as a physician, researcher and inventor, but his cholera theory would ultimately depend on his skills as a sociologist. And I just absolutely love this because it helps me to think about actually when you're trying to change systems, there are lots of different skills that you can pull on that you might not list in terms of like your occupation, and actually the collaborations that you need, the data that you need to make that a reality. The kind of sad part of the story really is that, yeah, government didn't believe them, and they sort of said this: an explanation of the remarkable intensity of this outbreak within very definite limits. It's been suggested by Dr. Snow that the real cause of the whatever was peculiar. In the case that the main source lay in the Broad Street pump, after careful inquiry, we see no need to adopt this belief. And so much so that they actually continued to extend that belief into launching new cholera commissions, where you can really, if you delve down into what they actually measured, to understand cholera, they looked at mapping atmospheric pressure, rainfall, state of clouds, and wind speed and direction was some of the things that they were looking at in terms of their data collection. And it just kind of goes to show you that even no matter how much evidence you can present to government, they might not always listen to that evidence. And I want to just kind of finish, I guess, the story here and open it up for some reflections. But I'm really compelled when I read this book about the story, because it just summed this up for me, that, you know, 1,000 changes ripple out from that simple act. And it's not that the world has changed instantly. The change itself takes many years to become visible, but change is no less momentous for its quiet evolution. And I just think that's such a kind of a wonderful summation of the fact that we're not really the change always. We're not dreaming up these big things that only we make happen. It's a very long-term vision, a long-term game, and we don't bring about that change necessarily always as an individual. In a kind of happy story, I guess, I want to sort of finish with you on a sort of a happy side. So Joseph William Bazalgette created the modern sewer system for London, and a lot of John Snow's work helped influence that. And I think what's a bit sad is that John Snow died before he saw his work recognised and materialised. But the Reverend, who was this sort of fierce enemy at the start and wanted to disprove him, actually made sure that John Snow got all of the recognition that he did, and he got lots of posthumous rewards and accolades and recognition. And I think that was a really wonderful thing to do. And one of the messages for me really about that is that, you know, as I said, you might not be the change, that when we're thinking about changing systems and trying to challenge them, that all of us are part of the ripple effects that result in that change. And the one thing I do kind of a lot of coaching of particularly like younger designers, and we always talk about getting there, getting to that place. And I always say there is no getting there, because we'll always continue to change. And so it's really important to dream, but to hold those as spaces and visions of where we want to go, to anchor ourselves towards there. So I hope, if you came here, you didn't think you were going to get told about a story about cholera and poo, I'm really sorry, but I hope it resonated with you. And I guess what I wanted to do is to just give you a bit of space to reflect on that story, and in your work and your practice and your lives, you know, is there anything that you know, on an individual basis, is you trying to think about changing systems, anything that resonated for you there that you think? You can use the chat to drop some thoughts in. I'm happy for people just to turn their mics on and speak, but I want to take like sort of 5 minutes or so just to give you a bit of space to reflect on it, or how you can be more Jon Snow or Henry Whitehead. I'm going to leave an uncomfortable silence for us, unless if anybody wants to share. I mean, I guess a question then to sort of lead that discussion is, are there people out there that feel they are trying to change systems? Yes, you don't need to speak up if you don't want to. Just please feel free to turn your mic on and jump in if you want.
I don't mind saying something.
Thank you, that'd be great.
Hi, it's Ruthie. Hi, Sarah. Great story. I think there's a really interesting thing about being a dreamer and a future thinker, when you're living in a world that isn't doing that. So I loved your thing just at the end about whether you ever get there. And I see lots of people who are trying to change systems, who are subjected to a recurring question, which is, are we nearly there yet? Are we nearly there yet? And there's something about helping the are we nearly there yet people to be able to sit with the discomfort of just being on the journey and not needing to know, where we are in terms of getting from A to B, or what even the end will be. The purpose is to make progress, and to make progress each day, and to move things on. And I think there's something that system changes have to do, which is holding a space in which the discomfort of the sort of undreamy people can be managed and contained, which kind of gives you the permission to do the dreaming. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Oh, that's perfect, Ruth, and it feels very similar to a lot of conversations I've been having recently about that uncomfortability, if that's even a word, of holding that space. Often many of the aesthetics that we use to plan and to guide are about getting it done, being there, ticking it off the list, and that's a doctrine really that we've all become very used to in sort of new management techniques. So I think the unpicking of that is difficult. Of the are we nearly there yet? So anyway, we've got some really great comments. Feel free, please, to speak up. I'm happy to read some out.
Hi, it's Jude. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about whether when the protagonists were doing all their investigations, whether they had in mind a master plan that they were aiming for, like a unified sewage system, or were they like, or was it just okay that they were, it seemed like it's okay that they were just uncovering truths as they arrived and moving things forward based on the new truths that they were uncovering, and they didn't need this master plan of a unified sewage system to be working towards. They just needed to move the world forward from the little truth that they were uncovering as it came to light.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation, actually. Does anybody else want to? I don't want to hog the limelight by responding to everyone's comments. So anyone else want to jump in on that thought? I'm doing dramatic pauses for the one of it's. We always feel a bit nervous to jump in on top of each other, or you just don't want to say anything. So I'm holding it for longer than usual.
This is Janvi. I just want to absolutely agree with Jude's point of view, and I thought of that too. It was very interesting to see multiple perspectives and different people doing, like, following their kind of actions and based on their thoughts and their research. But it also makes me think about when we're part of teams nowadays, and we're all kind of following our own paths and actions, but then also in some ways coming together, and are we able to demonstrate what we're doing and find influences with other people in order to kind of, and I wonder if that happened here, because you did mention quite a few times that, that they had opposing points of view, but then they took on each other's work. Somebody worked on someone else's map. And so it's interesting to see that, when people are able to come together on one platform to share what they find as a project or action is going on, how they're able to find those points of connection.
Absolutely, Javni. And I think picking back on Jude's point, I think there's always that real tension, isn't there, in the macro view and what we want to achieve and the micro actions. And I think that's where we talk about that kind of multiplicity or plurality. It's a word I can never say, and I want to say a lot. Plurality of perspective. How you hold those two spaces can be really difficult. And often, actually, it's not for all of us to hold both of those spaces as well. Some of us are much better at following some people that can set a vision. Some of us are much better at the bigger piece and some better at smaller. And I think it's just a real tension there, isn't it? I'm picking up on a few other comments just to be able to pick some stuff out. I see Anna talked about a reflection from the story, or resonating was being able to recognize patterns. And if there's anything coming out of this situation, it's probably patterns that we should be looking at in terms of what we can learn. I don't know if you felt confident to say anything about that.
Hi. I was thinking about, yes, being able to recognize patterns, and what you talked about in terms of what do we actually do in our, basically as our roles in our organizations and our skill set, and then the ability to recognize patterns and moving from this macro to micro views. I think it is something that really resonated with me. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting also is that the fact that we, a lot of times when working with governmental services or officials, or we're solving problems with them, we're trying to, is that story always about who owns which part of the pavement. Is actually remembered about like, oh yeah, we can't do this because the city owns the roundabout, and the National Roads, I don't know, Association owns the roads. And we can't kind of find a solution for that. And a lot of times it's it kind of reflects the fact that a lot of organizations are still working and thinking in silos. And a lot of times connecting those silos and having that conversation is kind of impacts how fast does that change happen, or how can we actually prove that impact in that sense, or get to a certain result that will then demonstrate that the work being done is relevant and will provide for positive change. But I really like this story, actually. We'll look up the book.
Yeah, the book tells it way better than I can. That's the very shorthand. You know, don't have to spend a few days reading it. I did actually read it on a beach, which was the wrong place to read it on holiday. I don't recommend that. Maybe on a rainy day is better. I think, Anna, you made another really great point around silos, and that's another thing for me that comes out of this story, is you rightfully picked out about the sort of the strand idea of the different pavement boards. And there's a really great book actually by Gillian Tett called The Silo Effect, which documents about 10 different stories of silos, how you can break them, and where they've caused challenges in the past. And one of the things I've always said is and I see it in I see so much. This story gives me everything, by the way. Like I see it so much from it. That by creating networks of people and actually focusing on building networks as opposed to trying to get rid of silos is really important. So that's something that I've taken from the story and learned a lot from.
I was just to say, Sarah, Rachel wanted a point made, but she's caught up with poor signal due to thunderstorm somewhere. And just to read out the point that Rachel was trying to say. So she said that she worked in a computer science charity and was frustrated at the time that none of her programs, lessons were built on. And she's left, it's been 5 years since she left now, and she sees lots of nuggets of that learning. And she's come to realise that institutional learning can sometimes take years to come to effect, which I think it is that time thing. And based on the story you were talking about, Sarah, it wasn't an overnight story. It was something that took a significant period of time, and our ability to ride the waves and be persistent, and that tenacity that's required to continue on that key mission that they all had, which was essentially obviously to stop the deaths of the people living in London.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for that input as well. Yeah, time is such a difficult concept for us, because it's such a limited resource that we have, and we can't create more of it. So it can feel really frustrating, I think, when you're trying to do this work, trying to change things, about the length of time that it takes. And that's why I love this story again, because it goes to show you about that length of institutionalized and systemic change can take a really long time. Is there any, I'm going to just pause if there's any more input, somebody really wants to say anything before we move on.
Hi, yeah, I'm Gail here. I just, my comment was really kind of thinking a bit just further on from those points made by Janvi and Jude on like creating those networks and connections between different silos or different professions or different forms of research happening kind of in parallel. And then I was thinking that there's so many people who like put in a lot of energy to make those connections, and because it's quite exciting, obviously, to find people whose research is synonymous with yours. And obviously that time element of the macro level. And you know, what happened in the story you were saying is that it did initially create local change, which then kind of rippled out. I'm just wondering if then the level of like the macro level and what they can do is sort of support that sort of mediation instead of like making the change at that level, kind of like actually just supporting those sort of smaller experimental models and like seeing, you know, what kind of happens from that, you know, in terms of investing in that level rather than making like huge systems change happen at scale straight away.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think I saw a comment from Vicky Drummond as well, pick up on this idea of the autonomy to trial things as well, and I think that's a lot of the personally the work that I feel really well versed in is trialing and testing things to see how they work. So yeah, having a kind of macro vision but figuring out a smaller, more local level about what works. Yeah, I think that's a really nice sentiment. Because I guess often those kind of macro plans and putting everything into place can take a lot of time. Yeah, and Jude, that's a great comment. If we'd not got the handle removed from the pump, the story could have been different or taken a lot longer, which is very true. Okay, I think what we're going to do is we're going to move on, and this will give you a bit more space now. I'll stop talking, I promise. Give you a bit more space now to have a discussion around this idea of designing in the uncertainty. And if there's any more comments, please feel free to use the comment stuff, because what we'll do is we'll get a capture of this and we'll see if Daniel from Civic, if we can send this out as a snapshot. But I think just before I hand over to Rebecca, is to say that we hope you enjoyed that story, and please hold it. The book's available. There's a TED Talk if you want to shortcut the book. I really recommend the book, actually. But hopefully that gives you lots of space for reflection. I think it's a wonderful story. We wanted to kind of move on to talk a bit about, designing in uncertainty, and uncertainty not being, it's not unique to human beings. And actually, that we have developed lots of ways of navigating uncertainty, our own sort of ways of resilience, our own tools, our own methods in which to do that. And you can see this when you look at like different occupations or different moments in people's lives. If you have ever been sailing or been on a boat, you often have a destination in mind. It's the dream of where you want to go. But you tack and jibe. If you haven't been on a boat before and you're sailing, you sort of move left and right and crisscross to get there. So you're choosing lots of small points in which to get there. So we've developed techniques to reach the ultimate goal, but to take small steps to get there. People who are part of the military are trained in dealing with uncertainty. Often if you go into the battlefields, you do not know what's going to happen, but there are tactics and techniques in which to deal with that uncertainty. Fortunately, at this point in time, and it may in the future because of global warming, but we don't really, if you're joining us from the UK, we don't really live in hurricane territories, although we do see flooding, but people have developed lots of techniques to deal with that, including things like farmers as well, and weather and uncertainty, and on more kind of personal levels, like if you self-manage a long-term condition, there's a lot of uncertainty in that, but you develop ways to manage that as best you can. And so as human beings, we have learned ways to manage that uncertainty. But I think what's really important right now, and I'm going to hand over to Rebecca to think about how we think about what's coming, or what might come, is we are not used to this amount of uncertainty. This is like uncertainty on epic proportion. Rebecca's going to talk through our scenarios, but it looks at different economic situations, at different forms of lockdowns. And we actually don't really know what's going to happen. And I think my mind's drawn to the news I saw yesterday about a second outbreak of I was about to say cholera, sorry, my mind is in the cholera space, second outbreak of COVID-19 in Beijing. And so things feel really uncertain. And what we want to bring to you for the second part of the session is a bit of a framework that we've been developing, and a bit of a space to reflect on what that means and how we might equip and tool ourselves for that. So I'm going to hand over to the lovely Rebecca to take us forward.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, this kind of has really come from the fact that, yeah, we're living in this uncertain world, and we need to be able to think round it. And that's not, we don't have the ability to predict the future, but we have an ability to prepare ourselves. So we have developed some scenarios by which to act as provocations. And this approach comes from from like Shell, the oil company. So park any sort of judgment around the fact that they're a big petrochemicals company. But actually, since the 1970s, they've kind of created these scenarios to essentially support their leaders, academics, governments, businesses to explore events that are only remote possibilities, and to really stretch people's thinking. So we've tried to adopt that methodology in the context of where we are now. So just in terms of what they are, scenarios are not predictions of the future. They're intellectual tools to prompt thinking, and they sort of help us prepare and adapt to a reality that we have very little control of. And within that, there's sort of two elements to it, and recognizing that we use different parts of our brain, as Sarah was sort of talking about earlier, around we need time to ideate and think about these things, versus we use a different part of our brain to plan. So you need to, when thinking about these tools, think about it in those two different segments, so you've got the space to do both of those activities. So the focal issue, you need to, in developing scenarios, you need to identify a focal issue. And we obviously picked COVID-19 and what the world would look like, and how we essentially, how it may impact what we do. And that could, the royal we being, whether it's Snook as an organisation, but also our clients, or on some of the services that they are delivering, and what that means for that, what they need to do and how they need to respond. So when developing scenarios, you look at the number of sort of variables, the number of different dynamics that are at play in that particular focal issue, and you pick two to focus on by which to generate your scenarios. And we picked the economic lens, and then the degree of lockdown that we may or may not have, and essentially created extremes really in each of those quadrants. And for each of those scenarios, we've kind of developed a more in-depth consideration of what the impact will be on a number of different dimensions. So whether that's on population health, whether that's on the amount of money people have in their pockets, the impact on public services, the demand and pressures on them, or how they may need to respond, the voluntary and community sector and how they may respond, environmental impact. So for each one of these scenarios, we've described what that may mean in these contexts. So I'm just going to sort of take you through the headlines of the four of them. So the first one in that top left quadrant is in a situation where we've got a booming economy, but we're still in lockdown. So we're sort of thinking at this point there's going to be some sort of economic reorganization as people shift to a more digital world. And obviously we're seeing dimensions of that, but we're using these scenarios, we're thinking bigger, longer term to sort of dramatize and exacerbate what that may look like. And perhaps an increased rising of local and the provision of local services, and the ways in which we get our food and our provisions, and an increased sense of community, where there's sort of maybe where there would have been differences previously. The second scenario, I developed these with my colleague Anne actually, and she has teenage children, and she described this one as an adolescent Britain. So thinking about when you're a teenager and you are more likely to sort of take risky behaviours. So this is the top right hand quadrant. So we've got a really booming economy, and we are not in lockdown. We're essentially living in this world where the virus still exists, but we've agreed, the decisions have been made to live with this level of risk. So that's where the sort of risk-taking element comes from it. So obviously the impact would be around, there will be still people in this situation who will be getting the virus and potentially dying from the virus. But there's been some degree of decision that it's important to do that to maintain the economy and prevent the sort of long-term implications of a recession, which can equally have massively devastating health and well-being outcomes for people. In scenario 3, this one's a real doom and gloom one. We're in the bottom left quadrant. So this is, we are in full lockdown and our economy has essentially collapsed. So, and because we've kind of decided to lock down for so long, the economy has been not able to recover. So, areas around people's well-being, not having money in their purse to spend on things, put food on the table, there are really quite big extremes here if we're trying to deal with this element. And there may be, thinking about for services, how do you deal with being able to support or operate and run as an organisation where there's not much money going around and people don't have the ability to spend, or you can't, you're having to make difficult decisions around the staff in your company. And the bottom right quadrant, finally, is a decision that we are remaining in relative state of unlockdown. So people have freedoms to move, but the decisions to unlock were sort of too little too late. So it has resulted in a degree of economic recession, which obviously takes, probably 10 years to bounce back from recession. So there's a long-term economic impact, and obviously the decisions taken affect whether those open wounds heal or actually just get more infected. So just before I go on to those ones, so yeah, essentially we would use those scenarios and have conversations with people to stimulate what that would mean from their own perspective, from their organisation's perspective, and how they would respond to those situations. So as I said, they're provocations by which to really stimulate thinking, and there's obviously elements of truths in all of them, but they're not predictions of the future, and they are quite extremes of all of those quadrants, as I said. But by thinking in that way, it forces us to prepare and to think about how we can respond to if some of these things may happen. And obviously, the real world of what may happen may be a combination of any of all of those factors may happen in a future date. But I suppose if you've looked at all of those dimensions, you've been able to think about it from the perspective of your organisation or as an individual.